Good morning, and welcome to our class in Modernism. I'm your professor, Boria Sax. The word modern can mean many things. For historians, the modern era is 1800 to 1850. As used casually, the word modern can still mean contemporary or up to date. But it suggests almost the opposite for scholars in literature and the arts. The era of modernism is primarily the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and modernism refers to an era of experimentation in literature and the arts, which was far more radical than any before or since. Modernism brought a profusion of movements as creators formed groups almost like political parties and issued manifestos. Fauvism, Futurism, Dada, Expressionism, Cubism, Surrealism, and so on. Whether aligned with the political left or the right, all were driven by a revolutionary mystique and often hovered between ecstasy and despair. Modernism did produce important works of literature such as T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land and James Joyce's Ulysses, but it did not, contrary to what many people expected, usher in an entirely new aesthetic, and it was followed by a return, with modifications, to old genres, values, and forms. Now, you may have noticed the color of my hair is white, so you know I'm no longer so young. I am certainly not nearly old enough to have experienced the heyday of modernism, nowhere remotely close, but I am old enough to have grown up in its shadow. After the end of World War II, modernism was remembered very nostalgically, especially in literary and artistic communities, as a time of great excitement. It seemed to be an era when creative people received far more attention than they did afterwards, and contemporary art, even for those who attacked it, really seemed to matter. During the Cold War, both sides tried to claim the mystique of modernism. For the communists, modernism was a revolt against capitalism, which was or would become anachronistic, but only as the capitalist system disappeared. But the CIA decided that abstract art, as the culmination of modernism, would be a perfect foil for the socialist realism of the Soviet Union, making the latter country appear crude and reactionary by comparison with the United States. During the 1950s and 1960s, the CIA promoted abstract art by channeling money primarily through a front organization called the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which had offices in 35 countries, published over a score of prominent cultural magazines, organized art exhibitions, held conferences, awarded prizes, and managed to make abstraction the dominant style of American art in the mid-20th century. Then came the period known as the 60s, when the cultural era when the cultural experimentation of modernism, previously confined to an educated elite, was embraced by a much larger section of society. The hippies and new leftists seemed to be in ways a vindication of modernism. Some people thought the rebellious energy of the period might be a perpetual condition which, renewed with every generation, would continue to push society forward toward some final apotheosis. But with the fall of communism in 1989, the passions that had driven modernism abruptly vanished. Part of the reason is probably that the expansion to a larger public had laid bare a secret of the modernists. Their perpetual rebellion and iconoclasm had always been dependent on the security provided by a highly privileged position in society. In the postmodern condition, Jean-Francois Lyotard proclaimed the end of modernism, yet in an equivocal way, with hopes that we might still draw on the vitality of modernism and even resurrect it. In his view, the modernist attacks on virtually all institutions, especially those of church and state, had been a form of icon smashing. In the nostalgic hope that when such deceptions had been overcome, the divine presence might once again become imminent. But today, living in the midst of a sort of holy terror, we search instead for relief in bonds of custom and tradition. Another turn of the wheel, however, might bring back modernism once again. Even more recently, in the book We Have Never Been Modern, Bruno Latour argued that the whole modernist idea of a radical break with the past had been from the start a delusion. It was based on an idea of time, especially historical time, as continuous progress. History had been artificially divided into eras that were distinguished by dominant paradigms articulated by seminal thinkers and separated by momentous events. But if there is no fixed direction, there is no forward or backward. Nobody can be ahead of their time, as the avant-gardes claim to be, or behind their time, as reactionaries. There is no longer any right or left, either in culture or politics. Modernism made demands on society so radical that they could not be coherently articulated, much less fulfilled. It moved between extremes of individualism and collectivism, unabashed egotism, and mystical annihilation of the self. A sense of disappointment was inevitable. But by now, even that disappointment has begun to fade. Well, as you can see, modernism isn't exactly modern. What legacy of modernism, if any, is still with us today? What parts of it might we wish to retain? or discard. Thank you very much.